The steady clatter of keyboards, the sharp rings of phones, and the rapid-fire voices from a video conference filled the luxurious corner office on the 30th floor of Brooks Pharmaceutical Tower. In the middle of it all, Richard Brooks, the 53-year-old iron-willed CEO and owner of a $2 billion zero-cents pharmaceutical empire, was fully immersed in high-stakes, million-dollar negotiations. His voice carried the kind of sharp authority that made it clear he believed himself untouchable. But then, a woman's voice cut through the air, calm, yet firm enough to silence the chaos of power. "Mr. Brooks, your blood pressure is dangerously high and I'm noticing neurological symptoms that worry me. You need to go to the hospital immediately." The voice belonged to Kesha Washington, 42 years old, wearing a janitor's uniform, still holding a rag and a bottle of cleaning solution in her hands. She didn't look like she belonged in this high-powered boardroom, at least not in the eyes of Richard and the other executives. Richard glanced up, his brow furrowing before a sharp, dismissive laugh escaped him, the kind of laugh meant to cut someone down. Lowering his phone, he looked at Kesha as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. "You're giving me medical advice now? What's your background again?" "Oh, right. Advanced cleaning techniques?" The sarcasm dripped off every word, and a couple of chuckles rippled across the room. No one seemed to notice, or they chose to ignore, that moments earlier Richard had staggered slightly, his hand trembled, and his eyes blinked rapidly as though struggling to focus. But Kesha wasn't just a janitor. For 15 years she had been a registered nurse, a seasoned professional in the neurology department at Metropolitan Hospital. That life had been ripped away from her by a manufactured scandal, a brutal act of racial discrimination that cost her her license, career, and reputation. Now, to survive, she worked quietly in the polished corridors of corporate towers, but her medical mind had never stopped working, and her trained eyes never stopped observing. For weeks, she had noticed the signs in Richard: slowed coordination, occasional slurred speech, moments of disorientation. Every time, he brushed it off as business stress, but Kesha knew better. She had seen these symptoms before in patients with brain tumors, aneurysms, or other serious neurological conditions. Holding her composure in the face of his arrogance, Kesha simply replied, "I understand, sir. I'll get back to my work." But inside she made a decision. While the executives returned to their laptops and presentations, Kesha began something Richard would never expect: documenting everything. Every tremor, every lapse, every repeated question, all carefully noted with time, date, and precise description. Richard thought he was in full control, that a janitor was nothing more than a shadow in the background of his empire. He had no idea that the woman cleaning his office was watching him with the trained eyes of a medical professional and holding a truth that could save his life if only he would drop his pride long enough to listen. As Kesha organized her cleaning cart, she cast a discreet glance back at him. The flush on his face was deeper now, and his left hand quivered faintly, as if resisting some invisible weight. In her mind, an old vow resurfaced: to save lives, no matter who they belong to, no matter how I am treated. To most, it was just a fleeting moment, a warning brushed aside. But to Kesha, it was the opening move in a silent battle between arrogance and duty, prejudice and compassion. And this battle would change the fate of both their lives in ways no one in that boardroom could possibly imagine. 5 years earlier, Kesha Washington was still a respected head nurse in the neurology department at Metropolitan Hospital. For 15 years, she had worked tirelessly, facing thousands of emergency cases, witnessing patients pulled back from the edge of death to miraculous recoveries. She believed wholeheartedly in the oath of her profession: to save lives, no matter who they belonged to or what their circumstances were. But one fateful night on the job would set off a chain of events that destroyed everything. Kesha noticed troubling patterns in the way Dr. Mitchell Barnes, one of the hospital's star physicians, prescribed pain medication. With both a nurse's trained eye and a sense of fairness, she saw it clearly. Black patients were consistently given lower doses than white patients with the exact same conditions, and were far more likely to be labeled as drug seekers or faking their pain. Unable to look the other way, Kesha began gathering evidence. For 6 months, she quietly compiled over 200 pages of documentation, medical charts, prescriptions, and internal notes. The numbers didn't just expose a medical bias. They revealed an uncomfortable truth. Racial prejudice had seeped into life or math decisions about patient care. When she brought her findings to the hospital's leadership, Kesha presented her data with the confidence of someone who had dedicated her life to medicine. Based on 15 years of experience, I can tell you this is racial discrimination in patient treatment, but instead of listening, she was met with cold stares. Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital director, responded sharply. "You're accusing a respected physician like Dr. Barnes of racism? Do you have scientific evidence?" Kesha slid the thick stack of reports across the table, each number, each case, meticulously recorded. But the so-called internal investigation was nothing but theater. Barnes was a close friend of the hospital's CEO and a generous donor. The truth was buried under layers of politics. Within weeks, the narrative flipped. Rumors began circulating that Kesha was emotionally unstable, that she was projecting racial issues onto medical decisions, and then came the most damaging blow, an accusation, unproven but devastating, that she had violated medication protocols. On her last day at the hospital, Barnes met her with a half-smile that never reached his eyes. "People like you always think the world owes you something. Maybe it's time you accepted that some places just aren't for you." The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. In a matter of months, she had lost her job, her license, her reputation, and her faith that truth would be protected. From a respected head nurse admired by her peers, Kesha became a janitor, walking the same hallways where she once led surgical teams. People no longer saw her as a colleague, she was just another invisible worker who came in to clean. But even in the smell of bleach and disinfectant, her nurse's instincts never left her. She could still spot the heavy shuffle of a heart patient, the telltale tremor of someone with Parkinson's, the vacant gaze of early-onset dementia. And it was those same instincts that led her to notice the changes in Richard Brooks, a powerful man whose body was sending out silent distress signals he refused to acknowledge. That day when Richard mocked her warning, Kesha didn't get angry. She had endured worse. But deep inside, an old resolve came roaring back. If no one else will save him, I will, no matter what he thinks, no matter what he says, because for Kesha, dignity wasn't defined by the chair she sat in or the uniform she wore. It was defined by honoring the oath to save lives, even when the life in question belonged to someone who had tried to diminish her 3 days later. Richard Brooks was worse. His symptoms had grown sharper, and so had his arrogance. That morning's board meeting was proof enough. He called the marketing director by the wrong name and repeated the same question 3 times in just 10 minutes. When he stood to speak, his hands trembled, his gaze blurred, and there was a faint slur in his words that no one wanted to acknowledge. As Kesha moved in to clear the table, she took in every detail. The subtle dilation of his right pupil, the slight delay in his responses, the clumsy, fine motor movements, classic signs of increased intracranial pressure. It was the kind of thing she had seen countless times in the neurology department. And it was the kind of thing you didn't ignore if you valued a patient's life. That evening, in her small apartment, Kesha opened her laptop. She knew she could no longer write an official medical report. Her license had been taken from her years ago. But that didn't mean she couldn't prepare something just as thorough. This report wouldn't be for Richard, he'd never read it, but for the one person who might be able to get through to him. Margaret Brooks, his wife, a Johns Hopkins-trained nurse who had left the profession years ago. Kesha had done her homework. She knew Margaret would understand the medical terminology and grasp the urgency of the symptoms described. Every observation came with a precise time, setting, and description. She noted the tremors, the disorientation, and the moments when Richard simply stopped mid-sentence, as if his mind had wandered into a fog. By 3:00 a.m., she had read the document 5 times, making sure nothing was missing. She slipped the pages into an unmarked envelope. The next day, a private courier would deliver it directly to Margaret's hands. No names, no trace back to her. But fate had other plans for expanding her mission. One afternoon in the parking lot, Kesha caught sight of an elderly woman stumbling and instinctively rushed to help. Her movements were quick and precise, testing reflexes and stabilizing the woman's balance. Those movements caught the attention of another passerby, Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired neurologist who now worked part-time as a medical insurance consultant. Patricia recognized the skill immediately. She also recognized the guarded look in Kesha's eyes, the kind of look that comes from being underestimated one too many times. When Kesha quietly described Richard's symptoms, Patricia didn't hesitate. Brain tumor, aneurysm, or a progressive neurological disease. Any one of those could kill him if you wait too long. From that conversation, an unlikely alliance was born. Patricia became the only ally Kesha could truly trust. She urged Kesha to keep documenting and offered to help approach Margaret directly. Still, Richard continued to deflect. He even told Margaret that a doctor had said he was just overworked, failing to mention that the doctor in question was a dermatologist, not a neurologist. Margaret's worry grew. She noticed him forgetting important meetings, retelling the same stories at dinner, and handwriting that had once been elegant, now shaking like that of an old man. The breaking point came one afternoon when Richard walked into an empty conference room and asked, "Where is everyone?" "The meeting was canceled yesterday, Mr. Brooks," Kesha said gently. But instead of recognizing her, he stared blankly and asked, "Who are you?" Kesha's heart sank. It took him several minutes to remember who she was. That night, she called Patricia. Today, he didn't recognize me for several minutes. This isn't arrogance anymore. This is active neurological deterioration. Patricia's voice was firm. Then we move faster. I'll call Margaret directly. As a doctor, I have a reason to be concerned professionally. Late that night, Margaret took Patricia's call. She listened as the neurologist explained terms like anosognosia, the inability for patients to recognize their own illness, and the urgent need for neurological testing. By the end of the conversation, Margaret had a plan. The next day, she would arrange what she called a family strategy meeting at their home, but in reality, it would be a public medical intervention in front of the people Richard respected most. What Richard didn't know was that his life now rested entirely in the hands of a secret alliance between a disgraced nurse turned janitor and a veteran neurologist who refused to watch him die. That day, the sky was overcast, and the early winter wind whistled through the trees lining the Brooks estate. Inside, everything had been arranged with precision by Margaret Brooks, the woman who had stood beside Richard for 25 years, and perhaps the only person left who could truly reach him. She called it a strategic succession planning meeting to ensure the attendance of the 5 highest-ranking executives of Brooks Pharmaceutical. But in truth, it was a medical intervention, one last gamble to save her husband's life. Richard appeared at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. Yet it had taken him 3 tries to fasten his tie. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, as if masking the unsteadiness in his legs. His left side was clearly weaker, his hand trembling slightly each time it gripped the railing. His face remained stern, but the corner of his mouth seemed to have lost some strength. "I don't see why we need to talk about succession right now," Richard muttered to Margaret as she gently steadied him. "Just preventative, dear," she replied calmly, though her eyes never stopped tracking his every movement. In the family boardroom, the executives were already seated. James Morrison, the CFO, and Sandra Phillips, the COO, exchanged worried glances when Richard addressed the marketing director as "that guy from sales." Margaret's gaze shifted to Dr. Patricia Williams, seated quietly at the far end of the table under the guise of medical consultant for the board. In reality, she was there to validate what everyone was about to witness. "Richard," Patricia began, her voice steady but firm, "I've noticed some troubling symptoms in you. Tremors, temporal confusion, impaired coordination." It was like striking a raw nerve. Richard slammed his hand on the table, the force toppling his coffee cup. "There's nothing wrong with me. I'm sick of unqualified people trying to diagnose me." And then it happened. Richard stood up, intending to prove his health, but his legs betrayed him. His body buckled back into the chair, the left side of his face twitching involuntarily, his eyes losing focus. I don't... He tried to speak, but the words slurred and broke apart. Margaret immediately dialed 911, but Patricia was already moving, her voice commanding with the authority of decades in neurology. Acute neurological symptoms, probable stroke or secondary seizure. We need transport now! In the chaos, Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Kesha Washington. Mrs. Brooks, this is Kesha, the janitor from your husband's office. Kesha's voice was urgent but steady. I've been documenting every one of his symptoms over the past few weeks. He has classic signs of a brain aneurysm or tumor. It's all in my report. The 47-page report I sent to the entire board 3 days ago. They dismissed it because it came from a janitor. The words hit like a physical blow. She remembered James calling it employee paranoia, and Sandra suggesting Kesha be fired for inappropriate behavior. Minutes later, the ambulance was speeding toward the hospital. Margaret sat beside Richard, clutching the file Kesha had just emailed her. The notes didn't just describe his decline. They documented it with the precision and compassion of someone who refused to give up, even on the man who had humiliated her. At the hospital, Dr. Chen confirmed every word in Kesha's report. A slow-bleeding brain aneurysm was increasing pressure on Richard's brain. A rupture was imminent and fatal if not for today's intervention. When Richard regained consciousness after emergency surgery, his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Where is Kesha? Margaret's eyes softened. She's in the hallway, dear. She's been waiting for 6 hours. She tried to save you weeks ago, but you only insulted her. Richard closed his eyes, tears slipping down his pale cheeks. He now understood the truth. The person he had treated with the most contempt was the one who had fought the hardest to keep him alive. The surgery was a success, and Richard Brooks was out of immediate danger. But inside the hospital room, the air was still heavy with tension, not only because of his condition, but because of what Margaret Brooks now held in her hands. It was Kesha Washington's 47-page report, each line a blow to the conscience. Meticulously documented tremors, memory lapses, coordination issues, all noted with timestamps and context. Weeks of evidence that could have saved Richard much earlier if only someone had listened. But her warnings hadn't just been ignored. They had been mocked, dismissed, and even used as grounds to suggest firing her, all because she wore a janitor's uniform. Margaret wasn't about to let that stand. She saved every email, every text message, and even recordings of meetings where James Morrison and Sandra Phillips laughed off Kesha's concerns, calling them paranoia from a low-level employee. In her hands, it was no longer just paperwork. It was dynamite waiting to blow. It didn't take long for the spark to ignite. Within 48 hours, the story leaked. Headlines screamed across national media, "Black janitor saves billionaire CEO who looked down on her." The internet caught fire. Social media turned the story into a rallying cry against quiet discrimination in corporate America. People shared Kesha's background, the injustice she faced years earlier at Metropolitan Hospital, and the extraordinary accuracy of her medical observations. Meanwhile, at Brooks Pharmaceutical headquarters, the board of directors convened an emergency meeting. The company's market value had dropped by $300 million, 0 cents in 3 days. Investors were panicking. The result was swift and public. Richard would step down temporarily as CEO to focus on recovery and a comprehensive review of HR policies. James Morrison and Sandra Phillips were both terminated for discriminatory conduct and negligence. But the harshest blow was personal to Richard himself. His arrogance, once considered part of his leadership style, was now a national symbol of dangerous hubris. News outlets replayed the same image over and over. The once dominant CEO lying in a hospital bed, alive only because the invisible woman he had demeaned refused to give up on him. Kesha, suddenly in the center of a media storm, was offered everything from large settlement payouts to book deals and paid interviews. She turned them all down. "I don't need anyone's blood money," she told reporters. "What I want is for this to be an example. Competence and dignity don't depend on degrees or skin color." Her words were printed in bold across newspapers, shared thousands of times online. The image of Kesha, still in her janitor's uniform, quietly returning to work after saving Richard's life, became an enduring symbol of quiet strength and unshakable principle. Back in the hospital, Richard spent long hours in silence, thinking. He replayed every moment, the times Kesha had spoken up, the look in her eyes when he cut her down with sarcasm. the patience she showed despite his contempt. He knew no apology could undo the past, but he also knew he couldn't leave it unsaid. When he was finally cleared for a short outing, he asked Margaret to take him to see Kesha. Facing her, he saw the same uniform, but now it carried a weight of dignity that dwarfed any suit he had ever worn. "You saved me," he said quietly, voice shaking. "I've been trying to save you for weeks," Kesha replied evenly. "You chose to humiliate me instead of listening." "I know. I don't deserve your forgiveness. You're right. You don't. But I didn't save you because you deserved it. I saved you because I swore an oath to protect lives, no matter who they belonged to." It was a brief exchange, but for Richard it marked the first step in what he knew would be a long journey to see if he could truly learn humility. 6 months after that fateful day, the spring sunlight poured over Washington, D.C., casting a warm glow on the city. Inside the massive National Convention Center, hundreds gathered to witness the Surgeon General of the United States present the National Heroine Award. At the center of the stage, beneath the bright lights, stood Kesha Washington, the woman who once had been dismissed as just the cleaning lady. The very uniform she wore while scrubbing office floors was now encased in glass at the National Museum of African American History, accompanied by a plaque that read, "The uniform of a woman who proved that competence has no color." In the front row, Richard Brooks sat in a wheelchair. Lingering effects of the surgery meant he still wasn't fully mobile. His hands trembled slightly, but this time not from illness. His eyes stayed fixed on Kesha, filled with gratitude, humility, and the sting of regret. Kesha stepped up to the podium, her posture straight, her voice steady but resonant. "For 15 years I was a nurse. For 5 years I was treated as if I were invisible. But today, I understand that I never stopped being what I always was, someone who saves lives, whether or not anyone recognizes it." Applause erupted through the hall, but Kesha simply smiled softly. She wasn't here for applause. She was here for the message. Her story had become a living reminder that a person's true worth isn't defined by titles or positions, but by unwavering principles and compassion. The scandal had forced Brooks Pharmaceutical into sweeping reforms. The board fired those responsible for discriminatory conduct and launched a diversity and inclusion program that quickly became a national model. Ironically, the company's stock, once in free fall, fully recovered as the public saw its genuine commitment to change. One of the most important changes was the creation of the Kesha Washington Institute for Preventive Medicine, funded by a $10 million zero-cent donation from Richard Brooks himself. Under the leadership of Dr. Patricia Williams, the Institute provided free medical training to people from underserved communities, those often overlooked by the healthcare system. Richard bowed his head, saying, "In my place," Kesha said during her speech. "He didn't know that my place has always been at the front lines, saving lives. He just couldn't see past his own prejudice." Richard bowed his head slightly. Over the months, he had reached out to Kesha several times, but she had kept her distance, not out of anger, but because she understood that some lessons have to be lived, not just heard. In that time, Richard had lost more than his job. Some friends walked away, certain social circles shut their doors, and the untouchable image he once cultivated had crumbled. But in losing all that, he gained something he had never truly possessed: humility and genuine respect for people from all walks of life. Kesha ended her speech with words that would stay with everyone in the room. "Revenge isn't about making someone pay for what they did to us. True revenge is becoming so great that their smallness can no longer touch us." The applause lasted for a full 8 minutes. Richard was among the first to stand, clapping with tears streaming down his face. Later, in the quiet of the hallway, he approached her. "I was a fool," he admitted. "You were," she replied without hesitation. "But fools can learn if they're humble enough. Thank you for saving me, even when I didn't deserve it." "I didn't save you because you deserved it," Kesha said, adjusting the medal on her chest. "I saved you because some things are bigger than how we're treated. And sometimes, the best way to defeat prejudice is to prove our humanity is greater than someone else's cruelty." 6 months after the award ceremony, the sun was high over Washington, D.C., casting a warm golden light over the city. At the Kesha Washington Institute for Preventive Medicine, the halls buzzed with the voices of medical trainees from communities that had long been overlooked. In one of the classrooms, Kesha moved among the students, guiding them through the art of advanced clinical observation, the very skill that had once saved the life of a billionaire who thought he was untouchable. Her story had already become part of national memory. That same janitor's uniform that had been the target of ridicule now hung proudly at the National Museum of African American History, framed and illuminated, a plaque beneath it reading, "The uniform of a woman who proved that competence, dignity, and greatness do not depend on the approval of others." In the front row at the award ceremony months earlier, Richard Brooks had watched it all from his wheelchair. He was still recovering from the surgery, his gait unsteady, his hands trembling slightly, but the greater change was in his eyes. Gone was the dismissive, superior gaze. In its place was the look of a man who had been stripped bare of arrogance and rebuilt with humility. Since stepping away from business, Richard had devoted himself entirely to philanthropy, focusing on medical education programs for minorities and underserved communities. He had lost friends, social standing, and the untouchable image he once prided himself on. But in losing those things, he had gained something far greater: genuine respect for the very people he used to dismiss. Kesha, for her part, had grown the Institute into a network of 3 community hospitals. Her days were long, but each one reaffirmed what she already knew, that real power lies in the ability to help others, not in titles or wealth. When Richard and Kesha finally crossed paths again in the quiet of a hospital corridor, their exchange was brief, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. "I was an idiot," Richard said simply. "You were," Kesha replied without hesitation. "But idiots can learn, if they're humble enough. Thank you for saving me, even though I didn't deserve it." "I didn't save you because you deserved it," she said, adjusting the medal on her chest. "I saved you because some things are bigger than how we're treated, and because the best way to overcome prejudice is to prove our humanity is greater than someone else's cruelty." 2 lives had been saved that day, one from a brain aneurysm and one from the terminal condition of willful ignorance. In the end, Kesha's message resonated far beyond the walls of any hospital or boardroom. The greatest revenge against those who devalue us is not to destroy them. It's to become so extraordinary that they spend the rest of their lives wondering how they could have been so blind. Richard knew he would spend the rest of his days trying to live up to that truth. And Kesha knew that her worth had never depended on anyone's acknowledgement, only on her unwavering commitment to who she truly was.